What makes Silvio's fate so interesting is that it sits right in the part of The Sopranos where people start confusing uncertainty with hope. By the time the show is ending, the world around Tony is collapsing so fast that every surviving face feels like a possible exception, a possible miracle, a possible escape hatch. Silvio is the perfect character for that kind of wishful thinking because he is not reckless, not stupid, not a hothead, and not somebody the audience expects to lose in such a brutal and sudden way. He is one of the few men in Tony's circle who always seems built for survival. He knows when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to act, and when to let Tony think an idea was his own. He is not just another soldier. He is one of the load-bearing beams of Tony's whole structure. So when he gets hit outside the Bing and the show leaves him in a coma, people naturally want to believe that means there is still a real future for him. But if you judge Silvio's fate the way The Sopranos teaches you to judge everyone else's, the answer becomes much clearer. Silvio survives in the literal sense by the last time we see him, but the show is almost certainly telling us that he is gone in every way that matters. The first thing that has to be separated is the question itself. If the question is whether Silvio survives the shooting itself, then yes, he does. The show directly tells us that. He is not pronounced dead on the pavement. He is taken to the hospital. He remains alive. By the finale, Tony visits him and the doctor's outlook is grim, but Silvio is still physically there. So if somebody argues that Silvio dies during the attack, that reading does not hold up. The series itself rejects it. But if the real question is whether the show intends us to believe he will wake up, return to life, and keep being Silvio Dante in any meaningful sense, that is where the evidence points strongly in the other direction. The reason this matters is because The Sopranos has a very particular way of handling injury, survival, and death. This is not a show that plays games with physical consequences for no reason. When it wants a character to survive, it usually gives that survival a dramatic shape. It lets you feel the return. It builds scenes around the fact that the person is still in the world. Survival in this show is not just biological. It is narrative. It has weight, aftermath, adjustment, and presence. When Tony survives being shot by Junior, the show turns the whole event into a spiritual and psychological ordeal. It does not leave him suspended in a vague condition and walk away. It gives him an entire stretch of story that makes his survival undeniable, central, and meaningful. He comes back weakened, reflective for a while, then eventually more or less reverts into himself. The point is that the show stages survival as a return. Christopher gives us another version of that. When he is nearly killed earlier in the series, the show does not hide behind ambiguity. It makes his survival part of the emotional fabric of the story. He is injured, he is vulnerable, and then he is back in circulation. Same with characters like Beansy, though in a different form. Beansy survives catastrophic violence, but survival does not mean restoration. He lives, but he lives as a damaged man whose old life is over. The Sopranos is actually very good at this distinction. It understands that surviving an act of violence does not mean beating it. Sometimes it means remaining alive after losing your place in the world. That is important because Silvio's case resembles Beansy much more than it resembles Tony or Christopher. With Tony and Christopher, the show creates the dramatic language of re-entry. With Beansy, it gives us the opposite. It shows that the body may continue while the role the person once occupied is finished. Beansy does not get his old life back. He becomes a living reminder of what violence costs. Silvio fits that second category much more closely. By the end, he is technically alive, but all the storytelling signals suggest he is no longer a participant in the world of the show. Adriana is the clearest example of how The Sopranos can leave a little bit of visual distance while still removing all real doubt. The show does not need to linger over a body for 10 minutes. It does not need a coroner scene. It does not need a funeral. It tells you enough through structure, tone, aftermath, and character behavior that you understand the finality. Bobby is even more direct. Once he is hit, there is no space for fantasy. The scene carries the unmistakable final stamp of death. The same is true for plenty of other characters across the series. Sometimes the show is abrupt, sometimes it is cold, sometimes it is understated, but when it wants you to understand that a life is over, it knows exactly how to do that. What makes Silvio different is that the show does not place him in either of those clean boxes. It does not say he is dead because that would be false, but it also does not give him any of the signs of returning life. Instead, it places him in a medical and narrative limbo that feels less like suspense and more like a conclusion written in a softer voice. Tony is told that the doctors do not expect him to regain consciousness. That line is doing a lot of work. It is not there to keep the mystery alive. It is there to tell you, in plain but emotionally muted terms, that Silvio's story is over. That is where people sometimes misread the scene. They hear that he is still alive and assume the door is still meaningfully open. But The Sopranos is not a sentimental show, and it does not usually plant hopeful medical uncertainty unless it intends to use it. There is no sign that Silvio's condition exists to create future possibility. There is no build toward recovery, no emotional emphasis on fighting, no secondary character rallying around the idea that he will pull through, no symbolic framing that suggests he is on the edge of return. The scene is not suspenseful, it is mournful. That is a huge difference. A good test case here is the Russian from Pine Barrens, because that is one of the rare, true, unresolved mysteries in the series. In that situation, the show genuinely leaves the answer hanging. It creates an actual hole in the narrative. There is no hospital room, no prognosis, no final confirmation, no later structural cue telling you how to categorize him. That is real ambiguity. Silvio is not treated that way. His status is not unknown. The show lets us know exactly enough to understand the shape of his fate. He lives through the immediate event, but he is not being held in reserve as an active future person. That is not mystery. That is terminal suspension. Another useful comparison is Tony himself in the finale. Whether Tony dies in the diner is debated because the show deliberately constructs an interpretive ending. It cuts to black and forces the audience to participate in finishing the moment. Silvio's situation is nothing like that. The series does not end on Silvio in a way that invites infinite possibilities. It gives him a diagnosis, a condition, and a context. He is one more piece of Tony's world that has effectively already been removed. The audience may want to do hopeful extrapolation afterward, but the text itself is not really encouraging that. And that gets to the biggest reason the show leaves Silvio alive, but unreachable. It is thematically stronger than killing him outright. Silvio has always represented steadiness inside Tony's regime. He is not the boss, but he is the best version of what a loyal underboss or consigliere figure can be in that universe. He understands ceremony, politics, emotional management, and discipline. When Tony spirals, Silvio often provides the nearest thing to structure. Even his few moments of visible weakness, like when he briefly has to act as boss and the pressure gets to him, only make him feel more human and more essential. He is not invincible, but he is foundational. So for that character to end the series, not in a dramatic, heroic death, not in a blaze of last words, but in silence, unconsciousness, and likely permanent removal, that feels exactly right for what The Sopranos becomes at the end. The show strips away any romantic idea of mafia endings. It does not give everyone a legend. Some people get humiliated, some get exposed, some get cornered, some vanish into institutions, some survive only in the most technical and empty sense. Silvio's coma fits that moral landscape perfectly. It says the machine did not just kill people. It hollowed out lives, roles, and futures. There is also the matter of how the surviving characters behave around him. Tony's visit to Silvio is not framed like somebody checking in on a wounded friend who might soon be back. It feels closer to a visitation. There is grief in it, but not expectation. Tony is not strategizing around Silvio's recovery because deep down he knows there is no Silvio-shaped return coming. The crew is already shattered. Bobby is dead. Carlo is cooperating. Tony is isolated. Silvio lying unconscious is not an unfinished thread to be picked up later. It is part of the proof that the family has already been destroyed before the final cut to black ever arrives. This is why examples from earlier in the show matter so much. Tony after Jr. is survival with narrative continuation. Christopher, after being shot, is survival with ongoing consequences but obvious return. Beansy is survival with permanent damage and permanent loss of prior function. Adriana is death without the need for excess confirmation. Bobby is blunt finality. The Russian is actual unresolved uncertainty. Silvio does not sit with Tony or Christopher because the show never dramatizes his way back. He does not sit with Adriana or Bobby because he is explicitly still alive. He does not sit with the Russian because his status is not genuinely unknown. He sits closest to a harsher version of Beansy where biology remains, but the man's place in the story is over. That is the strongest way to read his fate because it respects both halves of what the show tells us. It does not falsely declare him dead when he is not. But it also does not pretend the show left a meaningful future open just because a machine is still keeping his body alive. And, in a strange way, that outcome is more tragic than a clean death would have been. Silvio is one of the last old-world figures in Tony's orbit who still makes the whole operation feel like it has memory, order, and continuity. Once he is reduced to a silent body in a hospital bed, that continuity is gone. Tony is left with the shell of an organization and almost none of the men who gave it coherence. So the conclusion, if we judge Silvio by the standards The Sopranos uses for everyone else, is this: yes, Silvio survives the attack in the narrow, literal sense, and by the last time we see him, he is still alive. But no, the show does not seriously want us to believe he is coming back. It frames him as effectively lost. His fate is not a hidden comeback story. It is a quieter form of finality. That is why Silvio's ending lingers so much. It is not dramatic enough to satisfy the audience's instinct for closure, but it is too clearly shaped to count as a real mystery. The Sopranos leaves him in the cruelest middle ground possible. Not dead enough for a clean goodbye, not alive enough for hope. Just absent, suspended, and taken out of the world he helped hold together. In a series full of bullets, betrayals, and sudden endings, that may be one of the bleakest fates anybody gets.